Well, welcome, BookTube. Welcome back to the History Shelf. I am your host, Peg, and I am delighted today to bring you another author interview of an author I am personally just so excited I have discovered. And we're going to be talking to, is it Helena or Helena? I should have asked that.
Helena, like Helena, Montana. That is
Helena,
sometimes that
Montana.
makes
All right. Helena Schrader
yes.
is our guest today on the History Shelf. We're going to be talking about, she's written a lot of books, everybody. So to let you know, she's written a lot of great books, and I've read a couple of others, and I recently just finished reading this fantastic story, Moral Fibre. And it's put out by Cross Seas Press. Is that a well-known publisher?
Oh God, no. No, it's my imprint. It's just my own imprint.
That's
So it's
fantastic. Okay.
self-published. It's self-published. I don't want to go. I've published my nonfiction with with conventional traditional publishers. All my novels are self-published.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Well, we're going to be talking about moral fiber today, but before we get into it, again, I just would throw it back to you, Helena. Tell us a little bit about yourself for viewers who may not know your body of work, what brought you to this and where you're coming from today, which is really exciting.
Okay. Well, there's those a lot of questions, Peggy. All right, I'll
Okay.
start with I'm now I'm a retired American Foreign Service officer. Before I joined the American Diplomatic Corps, I worked in the private sector in investor relations, and before that I had gotten a degree and in research firms, and I had my degrees. I have a PhD in history from the University of Hamburg, which I earned with a dissertation on the German resistance to Hitler. And I got interested in history. So my first degrees, I had a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Michigan. I have a master's in international commerce, diplomacy and international commerce, and then the PhD in history. And I got interested in history and foreign affairs because my father was a professor of engineering, but he went to Japan when I was 2 years old. So he was on an exchange when I was 2 to 4. Then we came back to the States, and he went on another exchange to Brazil. So I was in Brazil from 6 to 8. Then he was back for 5 years, and then he went to the University of Portsmouth. Actually, it was called Portsmouth Polytechnic at the time.
Mhm.
And we spent 2 years in the UK. At that time, I was 15 to 17. And that very early travel was just impact. I mean, it's formed me. It's made me what I am.
Okay.
I like to tell the story because I think, when people say, how did you get interested in history? It was my father, because when we were coming back from Japan, they flew around the world. So they flown to Japan via Hawaii. And then the way the government is, they could fly back or continue around the world. And their flight was covered except for the deviation, sort of from the direct route.
Mhm.
And so they flew back via Hong Kong and Bangkok and Karachi and New Delhi and everything. Anyways, until they got to Rome, where my mother's sisters met us. They rented a car and we drove up up at the Italian peninsula and through across Switzerland and Austria and Germany, all the way to Denmark, which is where my mother's family was from, and then from there to England and home. The point is that my parents were traveling with 3 children, and I was the youngest. I was the youngest, and I was 4. And when we got to Rome, they went to see the Colosseum in Rome. And my mother thought that maybe as a 4-year-old, I wouldn't pay attention to the guide very well. So she told my father to do the tour with me, to take me around. And I still remember my father takes me to the Colosseum, and all he said was, "This is where they fed the Christians to the lions."
It's like,
And this
Dad, hello.
4-year-old imagination went crazy. Like, where were the lions kept, and where were the Christians, and how come they couldn't run away, and were they being guarded? And could the lions eat the people in the stand? And what if and I swear that's where it all started. I just started fantasizing about what it was like in the past. And
Wow.
obviously that matures into reading a lot of history, historical fiction growing up, and reading history books growing up, and just, and then ultimately studying history, and then making a very conscious choice not to try to live in an academic world, which is very backbiting and cruel, and
Oh,
to try to earn my money with other means
yep.
and do the writing on the side. So I
Wow.
made that career decision basically in college,
Mhm.
where after the history degree, I just did not go on immediately for the PhD. I instead went for the international relations, and I actually worked in Washington for 7 years with international consulting firms, and then went back for the PhD in Germany. But even then, I didn't intend to. I mean, having a PhD is really useful, particularly in Germany. It increases your credibility in
Okay.
job search, etc. And
Mhm.
I could leverage that into a job with the Treuhandanstalt. It was just when the wall came down in Germany, and I was employed with the German Privatization Agency, which is fascinating. I went from that into private equity, and I worked for private equity firms in Germany, and with a major bank, and then that right it transitioned into investor relations, and I did that for one of the major banks. And then I was headhunted for a company, internet company with headquarters in New York, but working out of Europe and listed on the Frankfurt Exchange. So they liked the fact that I was American, multilingual, and all of those kinds of things.
Yes,
So I
I was
worked
just going to ask how many languages you speak.
I speak German and English fluently. I wrote my dissertation in German. My husband's German. We speak German here at home. I
Okay.
also have been struggling to learn Greece because we've retired to Greece. So I've been struggling to learn Greek. I've been exposed to I learned Norwegian as a diplomat in Norway, but Norwegian is just a mixture of English and German.
Okay.
The Norwegians may not think that, but it does. If you know English and German, it's not that hard to master Norwegian
Mhm.
or Swedish. And I also said had exposure to Greek and French over time, but the only languages I speak fluently are German and English.
Okay.
Um, and so but through all that career, writing was my passion. Writing was what I did. Um, you can say it on the side. It's a lot more than a hobby. It really is a passion.
Hmm. Well, that comes through in your writing. I can just say that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I want to get into to more of that in a moment, as far as just the wealth of just historical detail and just the research you do is just amazing. Um, but I'm trying to think of like a good entry point into moral fiber. Maybe talk to us about like, was this one of your first books, or how did you
No,
come to this whole, the World War II aviation side of things for the RAF?
that 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 I don't know.
Okay.
Um, honestly.
Wow.
We went, as I said, we lived in England when I was 15 to 17. It was just 20 years after the war. The film Battle of Britain had just come out. It was really all over the place. And we lived close to one of the Battle of Britain stations. Of course, I went there. I think that probably was the trigger. I
Mhm.
was really fascinated by that, and I started writing. I tried to write a Battle of Britain novel a number of times, and it wasn't until 2007 that I actually succeeded. And at that point, of course, as you say, 20 years later, I have over 20, firsthand accounts. I have a lot. And the combination of memoirs, diaries, and other very things that are the first primary sources, and then of course, there's a lot of excellent secondary sources. And as the war, beyond the war, you got studying in the German sources, so you had exactly the numbers, and you knew which units are engaged where and when. And ultimately, I did produce a Battle of Britain novel, and it went out to reviewers. And then I got an email from one of the reviewers in the UK saying he apologized, he couldn't get back, wouldn't be able to post because um, Wing Commander Bob Doe had walked into his shop and seen my book. Wing Commander Bob Doe at that point was one of the few Battle of Britain aces that was still alive.
Wow.
He was an ace in the Battle of Britain. He went on to become a wing commander and commanded unit in the Far East. And he continued in the RAF after the war. And then at some point, anyways, he was at that point in his 90s or whatever.
Hmm.
And he'd visited this aviation bookstore, seen my book on the counter because the reviewer was reading it, and asked if he could read it. And the reviewer wrote me this email saying, "You don't say no to Bob Doe." And I said, "I understand that." So then I sat on tenterhooks because, okay, so someone who was actually in the Battle of Britain was reading my book. And
Wow.
I got this email saying, "This is the best book about the Battle of Britain I have ever read." And he sent me a handwritten letter. He said, actually, we ended up corresponding 3 or 4 times, in which he sent me an endorsement. He said, "You can put this on the cover." It got it smack on the way it was for us fighter pilots.
Wow.
And that's the ultimate for a
Yeah,
historical novelist.
I
That
can
is
only
better than
imagine.
any New York Times best-selling list or whatever, because that's just, who sold the most hamburgers.
Mhm.
It meant that somebody who'd been through it said, I got it right smack on. And that, as I say, yes, it came because I did all that research, but it's also, I think it's a lot of inspiration, tuition. I don't know. I don't know what it is. I suppose that success may have pushed me in this direction, or depends where you are. I consider myself an author who writes inspirationally, in the sense that I cannot, if you tell me like at the Foreign Service or something, so I need an article on X, Y, and Z. I can go out, I can research, I can write it, I can produce a nonfiction work on practically any topic that, if it's not, highly scientific. Let's say any historical topic, you ask me to do, or contemporary, politics or whatever,
Mhm.
I can do that objective research. For a novel, I need another level of inspiration.
Yeah.
It's more than simply saying, oh, there's a market for, Auschwitz tales right now, and let's put out the next book on the barber instead of the hairdresser of
Yeah.
Auschwitz. I can't work to formula, and I've had over the years, so many people said, why don't you write a book about, X? And my answer is always, why don't you? Because if you have that idea,
Mhm.
you're the one who's inspired by that story. I can only write about the stories that inspire me.
Right. Yeah.
And but I can't tell you why something inspires me. Why did the Battle of Britain, or why did, something like the Crusades inspire me? And I'm not the least bit interested in the British Civil War or the American Revolution or whatever.
Right, right. Yeah, it's something you can't really put your finger on. Just like as a little girl, you were you were your mind went on fire about the Christians being fed to the lions, you know.
And yet I've never written about Rome.
Yeah, we can't make
Okay.
sense of it sometimes, can we?
No,
Where
no,
inspiration comes from.
no.
Um, but gosh, there's so many different angles into this I want to take, but I'm trying to do it more of a
Well,
yeah,
let me go, because the thing with moral fiber, as I say, so that's maybe why I started getting to World War II, was possibly these factors, and then the success with and feeling like I had something, I did understand something. Of course, inspires you to keep working, and I did then a nonfiction book on the Berlin airlift, which is my best-selling book actually, and there was such material there, and it took a while for that to ruminate, and I come back to that, and we'll talk about that in another context. But after I had released the Battle of Britain book, that was back in 2007, and circumstances that don't have to get into the details, I decided to re-release the book at the 80th anniversary. So in 2020, I took that old manuscript, I polished the language, I put in photos. I had an editor. Part of the reasons I did this was that an Englishman said to me, it's still got Americanisms in it. Like the RAF's is right, but it's in descriptive parts where we say he looked out the window. That's no, he looked out of the window in British English. And
oh,
he
right.
said, this irritates British readers. So he combed through the manuscript now obviously those Americanisms had not irritated Bob Doe. He was focused on the content.
Yeah.
But many readers, as readers, were irritated by some of these, which they consider Americanisms. We tend, I think we're more telegraphic in our speech than the British, because they seem to be a lot of putting in ofs and these, and but anyways. So
Yes.
we did this scrubbing of the manuscript, and I came out with a new as I say, photos inside, which were everything. So I thought I got it really pretty for the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. And after I'd published that, there were two stories in it, or two offshoots of that. So they were like, I decided characters in it's called Eagle Where Eagles Never Flew, where I wanted to tell a little more about what happened to them, but it weren't full novels. So I did two novellas, both about 100 pages long, and I was planning to publish them just as a little, just as a little afterword, so to speak,
Okay.
to Eagles. And I was feeling very smug because I was done this, and I was sitting having a glass of wine before the fire, and I had this thing like, I can't do that. There's a third piece, because one of them's about basically someone who's burned and has this, is disabled because of a figure disfigured in a being shot down. The other one was about ground crew.
Mhm.
But I had this, flash of your that's not enough. You have to talk about lack of moral fiber. And for those people outside, this was an RAF term that was used to describe officers who had said lost the confidence of their superior officers. In other words, officers that were presumed to be cowards for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And the RAF had not expected it. All of their crew were volunteers. They had not expected to have crews refusing to fly. They were totally surprised by this phenomenon. And there was no clear institutional method for dealing with it because they were all volunteers, and you can't punish somebody for not volunteering.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's not like a soldier who was refusing to obey orders.
Yeah.
They can shoot them for that, as that's treason or whatever. But here they would just stop volunteering. Well, but they trained them. They'd spent years and years training aircrew, and then they were stopping to fly. This was actually more in Bomber Command, by the way.
Mhm.
Anyways, the RAF developed this procedure for dealing with people who were either refusing to fly or were dangerous. There were instances of people, gunners, for example, who would freeze and not fire their guns. That's a danger to the whole crew. They had to be taken off that crew.
Right.
And they had developed this term, lack of moral fiber, which of course was derogatory. It was intended to discourage people from doing things just to avoid, danger.
Mhm.
It was supposed to be a deterrent to people to, like, what do we call it, willful malingering or things like that. But it also caused some people to keep flying way out beyond when they should have, when they really were suffering from what we would now call PTSD, etc.
Mhm.
So it's a complicated topic, and an important one. And I said, I have to do a novella about this.
Yeah.
And I went, but I didn't know that much. And I went and started doing some research on this topic. And I had the great good fortune that a friend of mine works with the university in the UK, and she was able to go into her library system and send me articles on LMF, as a lack of moral fiber, from medical journals of medical, psychiatric journals, and also journals of military history or military medical history or something. I mean, it's very obscure things I would never have been able to find on my own. And I realized that the topic was, in fact, greatly oversimplified in most of the literature, so that you have books like Bomber by Lane Dayton, which suggests that they would just, arbitrarily, young people would be thrown off, they're out ripped of their ribbons would be taken away, and their commission would be they'd be, court-martialed and forced to do menial tasks. And that's not the way it was. And I realized that there were many more, there were formal procedures. And we get back to just statistics, that actually most of the people who were temporarily LMF went back to operational, went back on operations. It was a small percentage that really were humiliated and treated like cowards. Most of them either went back to non-operational flying. A third of them went back to operational flying, which means right back to the jobs they'd had. Another like 7% went to non-operational flights that could be instructing or doing things at transport or something. And then and most people went back to ground duties. And as I say, and it all took place through a procedure. They went through a diagnostic center. They were talked to by RAF psychiatrists, and the psychiatrists were effective in reducing the number, the length of tours. In other words, the doctors were quite sympathetic to their patients. They were not simply treated harshly. They were treated harshly at the squadron level because there was a risk of them, as I say, bringing down morale generally. So if an officer lost the confidence of his superior officer, he would be thrown off the squadron. But he didn't then just automatically lose everything. He went to a diagnostic center. He was evaluated by an RAF psychiatrist. And then after that, they decided the direction that he would go. And that story is very different from the normal depiction of them simply being thrown off and then going into disgrace. And anyway, so I wrote this novella, which looks at someone going through the diagnostic center. He's been thrown off his squadron, and there's these flashbacks to how he got there,
Yeah.
why he's there, what causes him to be there. And it was all about how it was, it explains, the stresses of bombing and all of these kind of things.
Mhm.
And it ends with the diagnosis, so to speak, and what happens to him. And then I sort of went to bed and woke up in the middle of the night and said, that was just the teaser.
Yeah. And it was because after that you went into a full-on account of
Right.
in our character, I should say, in both the novella, which I read, which was called Lack of Moral Fiber, and then you have the response to that, which I love, which is just like moral fiber. Like he's got moral fiber, everybody. And there,
Yeah.
I was because I read the novella before I jumped into the novel.
Good.
Yes, and I'm glad I did. Um, but you kind of highlight that I went into it with a presupposition,
Yeah.
maybe from just my other reading. I was like, oh, maybe it's because he disagreed with the war, or
Mhm.
or the tasks they were given to do, especially with
Area bombing.
aerial bombing of civilian centers and stuff like that. But actually, it was more nuanced than that, how it rolled out in the novella, and you kind of
Mhm.
explore there could be very different reasons. There could be very subjective reasons, at the time. In this case, the flying officer, Kit Moran, his best friend, right, is the pilot.
Yeah.
I don't want to give too much away. I want people to pick up these books, but there could be many mitigating circumstances for why someone would say, I'm not going out on the next one, you
Right.
know?
I think it's also important if you look at the statistics, like a third of the people who were lacking moral fiber, who were labeled that, did it in training command, which means it was not actually PTSD. Our normal assumption is that these are young men who have broken and shouldn't be being thrown out. It's the whole catch-22 idea of you have to be insane to be doing this, but if you go in and say, you can't get off flying because if you're
Yeah,
sane enough to say you shouldn't be doing this, then you're not insane and you can't.
yes.
So, and bomber. And I say there's an awful lot of things that have looked at this as these are the poor victims of a horrible war machine, and they are pushed beyond their limits. Um,
Mhm.
and the point, that's true. There are some of them that were pushed beyond their limits,
Mhm.
but it wasn't true of all of them. There are also young men who use the system very knowingly to stay out of being dragged into the Army or the Navy. And after 2 years of flight training and being in Canada and America and South Africa for the training, they say, oh, I don't really want to go on ops. I don't think I can manage that. And they say, fine, LMF.
Fine. Rubber stamp
Yeah, because
it.
they haven't been out there taking, they're not suffering from PTSD, they haven't been in it yet.
I
So
see. Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
But here, as you say, um, yeah, we raise the issue of, as you say in the novella, the issue of the volunteering for a second tour and
Hmm.
all of this kind of thing. There's, as you say, there are a lot of different factors and ways of looking at what's happening,
Right.
and at least I try to provide different perspectives.
Well, and that leads me into my next question. And we have photographs on moral fiber. We like on the back and on the inside. What I want to know is who is Kit Moran? And is he based on someone else? How did you create, or is this a historical figure? I mean, I wasn't quite
No,
okay.
he's no, no. I try, as I say, I try, and in Eagles as well. I read as many firsthand accounts as possible. I read a great number of say primary sources written by aircrew, RAF aircrew. So mostly pilots and navigators, the more sort of literate categories, a couple of gunners.
Nope.
I had one I also knew a couple. There are also interviews, taped interviews, on the Imperial War Museum has some,
Mhm.
and I met a couple of RAF aircrew. So but when you come right down to it, and I took some of the incidences, particularly in LMF, are based on accounts so that because I didn't feel like I could make up what it was like on an operation. So I would take descriptions of operations. And in moral fiber, as I put that in the historical note, I did choose to use some of the most famous raids
Mhm.
because they're the most well described. And so I could make sure that I wasn't saying something crazy and as a non-pilot, that the things I described happening were possible. They were all, and I did that by using known raids. But no one pilot, there isn't one pilot who did that. The same thing in my Battle of Britain novel, just to get back to that. If you take one pilot's then you're confined to one squadron, you're confined to like one theater, you're
Mhm.
confined to certain things. And by creating a fictional character, you can place them in a narrative that enables you to bring in more aspects of the total war situation that wouldn't be true if you're just following a single individual. So there is no record of an officer by the name of Kit Moran. What happened that I said going back to operational flying was possible.
Mhm.
Another thing he does is impossible or unlikely in terms of what happened.
Mhm.
But he is not an individual. He's certainly not a relative or something. I do have an uncle who died in Bomber Command
Okay.
over Berlin, who's buried in Berlin. His Halifax went down over Berlin,
Oh, wow.
but this is not his story.
Mhm.
Um, at the same time, I have a very, very strong sense of Kit Moran. So we're back to that sense of being told you have to tell the story. I do feel that whoever that is, that there is someone who wanted me to tell his story, and that we collaborated on this book.
Mm.
I feel that I am a voice for somebody. And I don't know what his real name is. I don't know if I got all the details right, but I do think that the the core of the story, certainly the idea of reaching a breaking point and then going back and being able to return to operations
Mhm.
in different circumstances, is somebody's true story.
Wow.
But that's an intuitive thing.
Right. Right. I never even considered it like that, but I think you're right. I think you have spoken for someone. You've told someone's story. I mean, it's got to be pretty close because another thing I want to say, you just answered it for me when you were just talking. But I'm going to let the audience at home know that as I'm reading these books and as I was reading, and we'll talk later on about the Berlin Airlift trilogy, but I was like, Helena must be a pilot. I mean, she must fly in her spare time because I'm like, wow, the technical detail, and I was okay, I didn't fly airplanes, but I was in the American U.S. Air Force for 4 years. But I've had my stepfather was a Navy pilot. I've been around pilots most of my life. I used to fly in a seaplane when I was a kid. And so I've been around pilots and and I know a little bit about airplanes, but I'm like, wow, does she know? Like, I'm looking up Lancasters, I'm looking up at pictures, I'm trying to imagine the insides of these airplanes. I'm like, she must fly. But tell me more. How did you
Well,
learn all this stuff?
I had about 3 flying lessons, and my husband then decided that we shouldn't be doing it. It was too expensive and too dangerous a sport.
Okay.
So he ended that.
Okay.
There's a Lancaster at East Kirkby. It's the East like Lincolnshire Aviation Museum where you can cannot they do not take it off the ground. But I was able to go in and I was actually sit in the navigator seat because that's where my uncle was,
Yeah.
and they run up the engines, and I've done that. So I've clambered around and over the tail into the tail gunner and into the bomber's position
Oh,
over the main spar and all that. So
okay.
it's sort of some of that kind of stuff. Um, with I said, I try to make the interior pictures, the checklists, etc. is right off an Imperial War Museum
Oh,
video of them doing the checks. And
okay.
I sat there and wrote it down so that I got the sequence,
Wow.
and then I edited it out so it was a little shorter than the real one, and things like that. Some of the incidences with the flak and the young man falling out when he's on the toilet and
Yeah.
nearly going off the aircraft. That is a real incident. You know, that's described in one of the accounts I read.
Yes, yes.
Um, so so
Oh,
I tried, as I said, I tried, but by I'm putting together real incidents, but they happen to different people, which is why, as I say, it's not. And if I just stuck to one of them, then they do one tour and then they go and they're instructing somewhere, and then you don't continue the story. I had to patch things together in terms of, as I say, descriptions of flying. The character, however, because the character is a very strong character, is obviously not patched together. For me, as I say, he is there as a human being,
yeah,
um, with beyond it's not he's not borrowed from these other people.
right.
Does that make sense?
Oh,
That the
absolutely.
technical
It,
descriptions I've borrowed from various places to make sure I don't get them wrong, but the overall storyline and the character development is something that's very
mhm.
specific to an individual.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it came across and it just, again, I was just struck by the amount of knowledge of airplanes and different aircraft, what, what makes them what they are, and even the flying preferences as the pilots in certain scenes are talking to each other about, oh, I'd like to take this one up, and test this out. And I'm like, wow, this is
That's the
authentic
way they
stuff.
are, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if you know, so my one, I have a cousin who is an Air Force general, retired now, and it was his, and I say, and that's my cousin, and his father's brother is the one who was killed over Berlin, or crashed over Berlin, went down over Berlin, and so I do have some connections, but I've
Okay.
always, I love it. I'm fascinated by it. I would have liked
Yes.
to fly, but I guess the
Well,
finances just didn't reach that far.
well, and I just wanted to note too, I love your lapel pin.
I Lancaster. I wore it specially.
Yes, I thought so. I was like, she's wearing it. That's the Lancaster. Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, so I think I'd like to talk a little bit more then about the universe of characters that you have created through your novellas. Because I've noticed, just because I've read the first two books in the Berlin Airlift trilogy, that Kit Moran and many of his associates kind of, they make their way into the Berlin Airlift, which, and I should say for folks out there watching, so Moral Fiber covers a very
Short, yeah.
finite amount of time. We go from
Yeah.
1944 through 1945. And then of course the Berlin Airlift trilogy, which we're going to do another author interview on those books because they're just amazing and we need more time for that. But they transfer through into like the Berlin after the war and the four quadrants. But anyway, Kit Moran and let's see, Georgina Reddings. Those are two main characters that do filter through to later. So I guess if you could just speak to some of your characters, and if you feel like you might do more with these guys. Well, probably I'm gonna let you talk because I can just keep
As I said, for
rambling.
me, Kid is very real to me. And so the objective answer is no, he isn't a real character. He's not someone I can't give his dates of birth and everything. He is very, very real to me. And I feel that he asked me to write his story. And as I said, I feel we collaborated because I knew I had to make changes to be able to be able to write it because I needed to have sources that I couldn't necessarily. And I don't, it's not like a ghost comes to me and stands in my room and I see them or anything, but I feel I do not fully control my characters. When I sit down to write a scene, they take over.
Wow.
I don't, it's not like I'm in a trance, but I cannot make them do things that they don't want to do because if you start to push them, it just all goes wrong. It just reads wrong. It doesn't
Yeah.
work. It doesn't feel right. And
Hmm.
you end up throwing it out and starting over. And so for me, Kid is a very strong character and a very real character.
Hmm.
And um, what happens to him, I think, is, I don't think I'm controlling it. I think I'm relating it. I think I am telling his story.
Yeah.
And therefore his life went on. I mean, now that's right now is a spoiler. But there was that. So I start working on the book about the airlift. And I knew I, again, I had one of these nights I'm in bed and I started realizing
Hmm.
how he gets involved. And I had this image of that telephone call, if you would just say, in Cold War, where he
Hmm.
gets the call and it's asked for the interview. And that's where it started, the whole
Amazing.
piece about Kit in the Airlift book.
Hmm.
And Robin, of course, who's one of the leading characters in the Airlift trilogy, it's very much the same thing. He's the hero of my Berlin Battle of Britain series or book, not a
Okay,
series, single
right.
book. And it was this thing. I know where Robin, I knew, that's what he did after the war. It's simply that's where he ends up.
Gotcha.
Um,
Hmm.
and that's what the little novella was. It was a story. David Goldman is a minor character in the Battle of Britain book, and that the novella about him dealing with the loss of his face, was just one of those things I felt I had to share because it's but it wasn't, it's not enough for a whole novel, but it just was something that
Hmm.
that I just say moved me. I mean, I had this feeling like I had to get it, I guess, out of my system or something like that, is the
Right.
best way to put it.
Wow.
So the uh and then you get things like so the other characters, so I can't say all of them, but definitely there are some of the characters are live outside of me, and they are they have a life of their own. How do I know that doesn't make sense.
No, it does. I've heard, yes. In fact, people who write really well, especially with fiction, have said this before. Like the characters, I sit down and then I can't force them to do what they don't want to do, just
Yeah,
like you
no.
said. So yes, that rings very true to me. Like you've created this character and then it has a life of its of their own. Um, but well,
One of my favorite stories is about an author. May I say this, Peggy? You can cut this out if you don't want to add it. I heard about an author who was going through a very bad period of her life, and she was out swimming in the Pacific. She was Chilean, actually. And she was in a situation where she thought she was going to drown. She was the current was so strong, and she wasn't sure she was going to get back. And because she was going through a very bad phase, she was on the brink of giving up and just letting herself go into oblivion, taken down. And then she thought of her characters, and she thought, but if I drown, they drown with me. No one will ever learn about them.
oh my God.
And
Wow.
that's what gave her the strength to swim to shore. And
Isn't
it is, I mean, some of the characters, not every single character of the book, because you fill a book, you have the main characters, and you fill it out with additional characters who are completely fictionalized and that you can push around. But
right.
the core characters, the ones that inspire you to write the book in the first place, for me, they're always very, very strong characters who
Hmm.
have a life of their own and have a mind of their own, and they can't, I can't push them around.
Right. No, that
And I
makes
feel a debt to them to write the book, which I guess the other thing, I really feel strongly when you say, why do you write? Well, I'm writing to tell their story, not my story.
that's
I'm
right.
not writing to make myself famous. I'm not writing to earn money.
Mhm.
Writing to tell the story of these characters.
Wow. Well, it comes through because you pack so much into these novels. I mean, so I'll just let folks know this is like roughly over 400 pages. Um, but there's a lot of novel in here. So it's like the reader is just treated to so many different adventures and but also a lot of like personal epiphanies. Like you've got a lot of really heavy themes in this book that you
Yeah.
explore from different angles. Uh, I'll let folks know at the end of the novella, lack of moral fiber, Kit kind of comes out of, like you said, going through the rounds of tests and talking to the psychiatrists and things. But now he's going back to do another tour. He's getting back into operations. And so this whole novel explores that as well as um, well, I don't want to give too much away. I'm trying to be really careful about, you know, love interests and
Well,
things like that.
okay. But the theme is moral fiber, and not just in terms of Kit himself, but in terms of those around him.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
that and very much what is that? What is courage? I guess I've told this book is very much about courage and grief. Those are the two main themes.
Hmm. Yes, having read it, I definitely I picked up on but there's also something else too. Um that I picked up on was the sense of, and it wasn't just like you said, it affects the people around those in uniform who are off doing these flights and raids and stuff, but like the character of Reverend Reddings, who had who has a tendency to have prophetic dreams or visions.
Yeah.
There was a point where he's like, I just sensed something happening, and it turns out, and he's like, we just bombed a bunch of civilians. I just felt that that happened, and it turned out to be the Dresden firebombing, you know. And he's obviously he's a man of God, and he's wrestling with that, like, do you want to speak to that really sticky area of World War II, those choices that
Um,
were made and later in the war to just to bomb or
oh, that's that. You see, I don't have a really strong opinion of that because I think that ultimately, or I try. I mean, I got obviously, Reverend Reddings is in some ways is my voice. He's the adult in the room, as I sometimes. So you have Kit and Georgina, very young people,
yeah.
and the crew is even younger, and they're basically teenagers and very young, and they're caught in this situation. Whereas Reverend Redding is old enough to be reflective, and he's obviously, as you say, he's educated, is the logic,
Mhm.
and he's a disciple of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he realizes they're also good Germans and not just bad Germans,
Yes.
and also that fascism, Nazism is not a German phenomenon. It's an ideology and it can wear any colors and every flag. So that he's the one who stands above that, what you're doing daily. Um, when you get down, I cannot too much that there's criticism of the of bombing, which was very popular after the war. The criticism first there was there wasn't even a bomber monument, that they didn't recognize it as a campaign, the fact that of course the strategic bombing survey claimed that it hadn't been successful, or that's the way most people interpret it. Actually, it's not what it said. I've actually read that more in depth, but that it was interpreted and portrayed as though they didn't do any good with the strategic bombing.
Mm.
The horror about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, even, I mean, leading Cheshire, Leonard Cheshire, who is, the most highly decorated bombing commander of the RAF, and commander of 617 Squadron, for the longest commander of 617 Squadron, what was one of the witnesses to Nagasaki, and comes out of it, totally pacifist, um,
Hmm.
after being a, you know, really strong advocate for bombing. That has made us, and then you get Catch 22 and Bomber, etc. What it's done is it has made the Bomber Boys non salon fait, because they don't, it's like they're much more has been written about fighter boys. It's they're defensive, they're easy, we can identify with them. We don't have to deal with moral issues and moral
Yeah.
dilemmas of what is right or wrong. It's much easier to focus on the white knights, shining white knights, the few saving us from the evil, than to confront the fact that our own bombers were killing civilians and the firebombing was, thousands of people going at once. And the whole horror of it has made us effectively denigrate the sacrifices of the young men who were doing it. And it has made it much too easy for either to just ignore it. The main thing is people just ignore it and don't even confront it at all,
Yeah.
or they make the bomber boys victims of an evil machine, and that way we can talk about it. But that I don't find that fair, because most of them weren't victims. They were volunteers.
Mhm.
Most of them stood by what they were doing. Who is it? I'm sure you're familiar with it. The there's an excellent uh, is it Patrick Bishop's book about them, which Bomber Boys. It's called Bomber Boys, and
Okay.
he looks at the fact that they tended to be more patriotic. They tended to be more interested in revenge. Fighter pilots were tended to be more interested in just they were more just the fun of flying, whereas the bomber boys were more serious about
Hmm.
outcomes.
Okay.
Different character. Also, you get different character again going into Coastal Command. I know I have it in my library here.
Bishop. Okay.
Fighting back 1940 to 1945. And he looks a lot at, recruitment, of course, and composition, demographics, and as I say, the difference, sort of the difference in mentality. Excellent, excellent book.
Mm.
Um, they're different, yeah.
Okay.
But I feel that I do feel as though that this focus on how horrible the bombing was has led us into neglecting, denigrating, ignoring the contribution that they made, because ultimately they were that's why I say taking the war to Hitler, the Allies, what Britain, they didn't have any way of fighting back. The bombers was the only thing they had.
That's right. People forget that.
And they also forget how many British were killed. There was 50,000 people were killed in the Blitz.
I
I mean,
was
we
just
look
going to say
at
that. Yeah.
Ukraine and people, 42 people and this and that. In the V1s and the V2s, they were killed tens of thousands. I have the numbers somewhere. I don't have it at the top of my head.
Hmm.
It's enormous.
Hmm.
And yes, it's less than it was Nagasaki. And we look back, and because we look back, we think of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And we say, oh, but that was nothing compared to that. Yeah. But in 1940 or 1941, 43, tens of thousands of people, civilians being killed, and that's only in Britain, add that, Warsaw, add Guernica. You look at the people fighting in 1940, they hadn't seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki yet. They
Yes.
didn't know what Dresden was going to do.
Yeah.
For them, they had been the victims. They had been the victims. It had been their homes and their churches and their old aunties that had been killed.
Right.
And that neat feeling that they had to take the war to the Germans and they had to make them feel what it was. I'm someone who does not like Bomber Harris. I have no actually very negative feelings about Bomber Harris.
Hmm.
But he had when he said the Germans started this war with the naive notion that they could bomb everybody else and nobody would bomb them. He's right.
That is a
And
very, yes, it's a
you know,
profound observation because, yes, when you think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and people, I've heard this before too, and where people are just like, and it was awful. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't, but then it's like, well, you know what? We weren't looking for a war, and and Japan decided to bomb Pearl Harbor. So
that,
actions have consequences. I don't know why.
yeah,
And in wartime, it's taken to an exponential, you know, the horrors and everything else are just magnified because it's war, and it's supposed to be hell, as General Sherman famously said, war is hell. But yes, gosh, thank you for putting some context around that because, just the reading from the novel itself, there was so much danger involved in just getting into one of these aircraft. I
yeah.
mean, and then the flak. Oh my gosh, I can't even imagine how they flew through flak.
But
And
the weather, I mean, the thing
the
starts with the
weather.
weather, the technology, getting back on the airfields. There's some horrible Black Friday, Thursday where
Yeah.
the airfield in England would close down, and they lost more bombers landing in England than they lost over Germany because
Hmm.
they couldn't see to land. They run out of fuel, and they had nowhere to go except down.
Oh, Lord.
Ground will kill you every time.
Mhm.
And then, as of course, the technical problems, and then the flak, and then the night fighters. And it just, but as I said, trying to balance why I have the adult in the room of Reverend Reddings talking about the problem with Dresden is it wasn't necessary.
Yeah.
Problem with Dresden, they did it because they could at that point,
Hmm.
not because it was. If you go back to just war, if you go back to the theory of St. Augustine, etc., the point of a just war is you have to be in defense, which the Second World War was,
Hmm.
of the innocent, which it was,
Okay.
but it also has to be proportionate.
Mm.
And for much of the war, it was actually they had almost nothing. I mean, the early years of the war, they'd send out, a couple of twin engine bombers to bomb Berlin, and they could drop, 5 tons or whatever. The Germans laughed about it. And the young men, 50% of them would be lost.
Wow. Mm.
And most of the time, and then only as the industrial war production speeds up and all, they start. churning them out, and they have enough crews, because it took 2 years to train a crew. It wasn't just building an airplane. It was much easier to build an airplane than to train aircrew. When they finally, after 43, they start to have enough crews, they have the first 1,000 bomber raids, the British first bomber. Germany had flown 1,000 aircraft over London in September 15th, 1940.
Mm.
It's not until May of 1943 that Britain can launch 1,000 bombers, because that's not counting the fighter escorts. So it may have been somewhat earlier, but it's almost 2 years that they've been taking it from Germany.
Yeah.
And yes, the Blitz did ease up, but the Germans continued to bomb throughout the war, particularly night bombing. And they were also close to cutting the Atlantic lifelines. The book I'm working on now is going to be about Malta, and I've been reading up on the merchant navy and the losses at sea. And when you see how close they come, we're talking, there were nights when the wolf packs took out 30 or 40 ships. 30 or 40 ships.
Wow.
In a single night.
Yeah, that's insane numbers.
It's insane numbers. And they sank so close, over 1 million tons in a single month, etc., of shipping. And they you can't build ships that fast either, or train crews.
Right.
But that's going on during the bomber. In other words, the bomber offensives was a response, because that was all they had, was the bomber offensive. And so I don't want to justify Dresden. I know people who were in Hamburg lived in Germany for over 20 years, who lived in Hamburg during the firebombing. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
But so was being the victim of a V2, which was a modern rocket, for which there was absolutely no
answer for that, right? Or
the only thing was take out the launch pads.
Okay.
And that required bomber command.
Okay.
They were coming in from 8 miles up or whatever at 1,000 miles an hour. There was nothing I don't know. I have it written down somewhere, but the V2s were modern rockets. They were not drones like the V1s, and they weren't aircraft. And the RAF had nothing to fight them with once they were coming in. The only thing they could do was bomb the launch site. So we're back to, I am much more sympathetic to the bomber offensive, I think, than most people, because if you know the entire environment in which they're operating, it was the only weapon they had until they went across at Normandy.
Gotcha. Right. Let's see. Was it called the 617 or the 617th Squadron?
617 Squadron.
Okay, so 617th Squadron. They had quite a reputation, right? Can you speak to that? Because when I got to that part of the book, it's a part where Kit and his crew have an opportunity to join this very famous squadron, but it was quite quite dangerous as well.
Well, the thing is, what your point exactly, what your perfect segue, because 617 was a precision bombing squadron.
Okay.
So the key thing about 617 was they didn't do the area bombing, the what they call the dehousing,
dehousing, yeah.
Yeah.
A nice.
These are the Bomber Harris's euphemisms for his euphemism. I don't have precision weapons, so I'm just gonna pound them back into the Stone Age.
Yeah.
And we all have fundamental problems with that. And so I took the easy way out too, if you like, but I also wanted to draw attention to the fact that the RAF actually had some of them. We tend in the States that we did precision bombing. We didn't. As the best example, the British did area bombing. That's not aerial, area bombing.
Area bombing, yeah.
Very precisely, and the Americans did strategic bombing very loosely.
Is area bombing kind of the same as carpet bombing? Because we have that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all right. You're just hitting a city as opposed to trying to hit a specific. Well, there were a number of elite squadrons in the RAF which did precision bombing. 617 was the most famous, but there were a number then later there were mosquito squadrons, which did that as well. And 617 and number 9 squadron were two of the large Lancaster squadrons that did precision bombing. And as I say, there were later other squadrons. I don't know exactly the number. I'd have to go back and check. But I wanted to highlight in the book they did have these. And these squadrons, 617 was proud of the fact that if they attacked a marshalling yard, they didn't drop a single bomb outside of the perimeter fence.
Right.
When Cheshire attacked a factory in, he was leading the squadron at the time, a factory in France that was building aerial engines at one of the manufacturing, he personally flew over the factory several times, buzzing it very low so the workers figured that they were being attacked and they all got out. They lost not a single French worker in the attack.
Mm.
617 is most famous. They were formed for the attack against the dams. So the three dams, it's in the Dam Busters.
The Dam Busters, yeah.
This is the Dam Buster Squadron. And having formed the squadron, they then there was talk about disbanding it, and then they decided to go ahead and they tried to use it again to try to take out a canal. Again, they had horrible losses, lost the squadron leader, and it was on the brink of being disbanded when they gave it to Cheshire. And Cheshire worked at turning it into this a really precision bombing unit. And they just practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced. And then when they went in, as I said, they were surgical. And based on this experience, the number 9 squadron also converted to the same kind of bombing, as I said, and then they started using mosquitoes in a precision bombing role where they could take one building out. The famous one was they went for the Gestapo headquarters, and the first 2 mosquitoes took out the guard rooms on the ends. The next one put a bomb in the courtyard where the explosion wave broke open the doors, and then the hundreds of resistance fighters fled without but they weren't killed. Some of them, of course, were caught by the Germans and then shot, etc. But the RAF there's another one where they took out a headquarters between 2 university buildings. And they hit just that one building. It was low level, precise bombing. 617 worked with Barnes Wallace, who developed the bouncing bombs. He also developed 2 other kinds of high-tech bombs, the tall boy and the slam, the earthquake bomb. I'm forgetting exactly what they called it. And those were very different. They were high-level bombing, but the earthquake bomb went, as it says, it went in and it created a mini earthquake and caused buildings to collapse in the immediate vicinity.
Wow.
It also had the ability to penetrate concrete. It was the only bomb that could
like
get
a bunker
through
buster, right?
a bunker, right?
Okay.
And they took out, as I say, that they placed bombs on the factory, which was producing the super submarines. These submarines could go faster underwater than merchantmen, sometimes twice as fast as the merchantmen on the surface. They were extremely, extremely dangerous. And they were just starting to go into production, and they sent 617 in, and the bombs pierced through the concrete and exploded inside, just wrecking all of the equipment. And that way they didn't get another one of those submarines out. That did kill workers, but they took that in account. They had
to.
But this is as opposed to doing the carpet bombing, the area bombing, which the housing, which the main force was doing at night. 617, 9 squad, these precision squadrons really went for. And God, with the arrogance of hindsight, you feel like if they had had more of those squadrons, they probably could have done more good.
Yeah.
But getting crews up to the level for first of all, some of the bombs they didn't have until 1944. The navigation equipment they didn't have until 43. They didn't have the bomb sights until later the war. The equipment they had in 1940 was the British had barely had single monoplane bombers in 1940. The level of technology they had in the 40 to 42 was very, very low. I mean, the Lancaster doesn't start coming onto squadrons until 42. They didn't have a means of doing the kind of things that they did later with the equipment that 617 and with the Mosquito, which was an amazing plane, or with the torpedo bombers. I'm going to be looking at torpedo bombing, as I say in my book on Malta. Again, torpedo bomb with extremely precise weapons. Horribly, horribly high levels of casualties. But getting crews to the levels, I mean, you don't have to have equipment, you also have crews that can deliver those weapons precisely. And 617 was taking people with 1 or 2 operational tours, which means they have done 30 to 60 ops on another squadron. And you can't you can't do that training in an environment without the flak and the fighters. Because to be able to deliver these kinds of weapons in an operational environment, you have to have the crews that don't freeze and that don't get nervous, and you have to have you don't know who they are until they're there.
That's true. Yeah, and you explore that in the novel. I'm going to just keep it high level so I don't give away any
Yeah.
spoilers, but eh, like the majority of the story is about the training, and you kind of show how crews were formed, which was actually not very scientific, which I have found very entertaining. They just kind of got all these guys together in a room, and they knew, okay, well, we need one navigator, one flight engineer, one, midship gunner, or you know what I mean? Uh, and they just kind of would come together as it, just to
Well,
see.
they were told to sort themselves out. I just love it. Such a British expression. Sort yourselves out. So they were just put together in a hangar, all with the right numbers of everybody, and said, sort yourselves out. And the RAF stuck to this, the US assigned crews. The RAF was right. I mean, every book I've read has come down to saying what happens is there's a chemistry, and if the crews clicked, they clicked.
Yep,
And if they clicked, they had a higher chance of survival. And every time the
absolutely.
crews got broken up, where somebody gets killed and a strange body came in, that group dynamic could get dis disrupted.
Mhm.
Sometimes it still worked. Sometimes somebody could fit in. There's one of the memoirs I read. He had two horrible flight engineers, and then the right guy came onto the crew, and it was the right one. And you have other cases where, as I say, where the crew has come to the squadron leader will say, we can't fly with X or Y. You know,
Yes.
and they would take somebody off. But on the whole, 9 out of 10 times, actually, young men, they would click. And what was fascinating about that is that the RAF, in retrospect, I love something as a history. It's not just the primary sources are great, but also the retrospective things are very valuable. They found that the best crews were mixed crews. Mixed in that context, not nowadays,
Yeah.
was not men and women. There were no flying women, but they were colonials and Brits. It was, if there was an Australian, there were Canadians, there were New Zealanders, there were West Indians. By the way, no segregation in the RAF. West Indians were commissioned officers and
Hmm.
flew on crews. One of the good memoirs I read, he had a West Indian, no, he was a Caribbean gunner on
Hmm.
the some tension when South Africans were rude to him, and his crew always stood by him. Just put up with that.
Yeah.
But the RAF recognized that purely British crews actually weren't as strong as ones where there was some mix of other people. Also, Free French and some American volunteers were in the RAF as well.
Mhm.
And they mixed crews, nationally mixed crews, tended to be the strongest crews.
Isn't that
And whether
fascinating?
there was some sort of national rivalry that got them to being their best, or whether it was they complemented each other,
Hmm.
or some dynamic led to them. So that even like the Canadian Royal Canadian Squadron wouldn't be all Canadians. They'd actually have a lot of Brits or Australians and other people in them. And the same thing with a Australian squadron or whatever.
Yes.
They
Well,
kept the mix.
I love that aspect of the book. I'm pretty sure the Americans didn't do it this way. And
So,
but I really liked it because I do believe in this having chemistry and having people that you just really, want to fly with. It can increase your chances of coming back. But you mentioned South Africa, and I wanted to touch on this as well because not only do you kind of explore the moral fiber question and just ethical questions throughout the book, but in a very, very subtle way. It's just it's a wonderful story. Um, but Kit Moran is South African, and so there's
well,
an element where you kind of
yeah,
explore. Um, his grandmother was an actual, she was a South African native, so
black.
she was
Yeah,
black,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
but he kind of, I guess he's light, it doesn't matter to me, but in the book, at the time, some people didn't know that
That's right.
that, so you also deal with some racist, assumptions, but they don't overwhelm the plot. If you wanted to touch on that aspect, and why did you decide to put that in the book too?
Oh no, well, you had asked me about why did I put the African connection in?
Yeah.
And I think there's a couple of factors. Again, in terms of, I feel a lot of this is inspirational. I think that's what Kit's story is. But if you don't want to believe that, and a lot of people don't like to think of that, I have spent a lot of time in Africa. I spent 7 years in Africa. When I was writing this book, I'd only been out of Africa for a couple of years. Africa means something to me.
Hmm.
At the same time, I was really, really, a lot of reason for writing this book is my concern about what's happening politically now. And the rise of fascism or the rise of authoritarianism, the um, the horrible parallels between what's happening now and what was happening when Hitler came to power.
Hmm.
As I said, I wrote my dissertation about the German resistance to Hitler, which means I spent when I was working on my PhD, I read a huge amount of material. I did a lot of interviews of people who lived through Nazi Germany.
Hmm.
And the idea of how Hitler came to power is one issue. And then after he was in power, how very difficult it was to fight him. We underestimate that. We forget that once an authoritarian power once authoritarianism is entrenched, it takes practically the army, or a war to get them out. There is no war. It's very, very difficult as a civilian
Hmm.
to fight against an armed authoritarian regime. Um, so there's this sense that as someone who knows the history and seeing things repeat themselves, made me feel I really wanted um, to address that. And yet I write historical fiction. I don't write dystopian fiction. I don't write about contemporary fiction. And
Hmm.
in that context, I wanted to draw certain parallels. And I felt that by pointing out that National Socialism, Nazism is not really a national phenomenon, it's an ideology, and that ideology can wrap itself in different colors and different flags, as
Hmm.
Reverend Reddings did. And given the fact that racism is a very key component of modern authoritarianism in this country, I thought that having some reference to how race also is a is a factor in and I know in authoritarianism how authoritarianism misuses those kinds of prejudices. Whether in Nazi Germany it was against Jews, in the United States it's
Right.
against immigrants and blacks.
Yeah.
So
The
I
fear
felt
of
I
the
had to be
other.
more explicit.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
So adding that little bit of an element was to make it easier to make the parallels.
Yes, I could
Okay.
see those quite clearly in the novel, and just, being a citizen of the country. It's like you said, it's hard once things are entrenched for people who resist, to especially when more than half of your the populace, is voting for it and going along with it. You know what I'm saying? It can be insurmountable at times, that feeling. But at the same time, the inspiration in the fiction shows that, it's never, this is just me talking, but it's never a losing battle, at least spiritually, for your own self. It's never a losing battle to
That's
stand up for what you believe in and
that's
what you
it.
think, and
Absolutely.
yes, and what you feel is right. You
Yes.
have to
Yes.
keep fighting and
Yeah.
resisting.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
As I said, that's of course more explicit, and I've written a novel. As you said, I've written a lot of novels. I've
Yeah.
written a novel about the German resistance to Hitler because having done my dissertation on that, I had done so much research. I met so many people. I'd done so many interviews, and I put a lot of that. I put it into a novel. That was my first novel. Was the German resistance novel. It's not the first novel I published. It was the first novel I finished. I really wrote, and it's too complex. I mean, as a mature writer, I say you did try to do too much in it. You tried to put too much in it. It's not a great work of literature. But I reissued it as an ebook last year because I just think I wanted to get the story out there, and
Mhm.
that yeah, one of how just how horribly difficult it is once an authoritarian regime has been established. But the other thing is that resistance isn't about whether you can win or not. Ultimately, the German resistance was about showing that they existed.
Mhm.
And it
Absolutely.
was a moral resistance, and that is what attracted it to me in the first place. It was not a tactical resistance. It wasn't fighting an invader. It wasn't fighting the other. It wasn't fighting the occupiers. It was fighting their own regime because it was morally wrong.
Right.
And it's a totally different quality of resistance.
Mhm.
I find it very, very inspiring and also very depressing, obviously. But
Yes. Yes. And in the ways that history does seem to be cyclical and does seem to repeat itself. And that's my love of history too, is like I feel like history is the greatest teacher. I just feel like not many
Oh, yeah.
people are open to its lessons, or they think it's all long gone in the past, but they don't really understand the power that history has to shape the present, or does shape the present, and will continue.
Does, yeah.
Yeah, and will shape the future. But we all have moral agency, and we can make our individual choices that,
Mhm.
in the aggregate can have an impact, a positive impact. So, um, yeah.
But the thing is, by looking at historical examples, I've always well, the reason I write is to inspire people to go on living, which is a quote from someone else. But I mean, I really have been very focused on. I like a positive story, but it has to be a story which is based in reality. It's not about insipid everything. It's not Little House on the Prairie.
Right.
But I do want I hate books that leave me with feeling that there's no hope. So I like my books to have elements in it. Doesn't mean everything goes well for everybody or that everything turns out the way you want it. Certainly
Hmm.
not my resistance novel. But it is about those what do we call it? Beacons of light, beams of light, of positive, of inspiration that I hope to include.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, and I'm curious to know your experiences. We talked about this earlier, it wasn't in the video, but your experiences of writing from as a woman. And I wanted to touch on that. Just the feeling that you've kind of maybe had a little bit of not to say an
I
uphill
in
battle,
in
but
retrospect,
yeah.
yeah, it's hard to know. It, there's a couple of things that could go into that. One of that we can maybe do it another time. Why did I go the self-published route? And I can
Hmm.
explain that. But that's a long story. The idea, the feminist issue is I probably made a mistake writing as a woman. I probably would have been more successful if I had used a pseudonym or at least neutralized, degenderified my name, making it H.P. Schrader or something, because there's still a bias about women being able to talk about aviation or military affairs or this, even ancient Sparta or whatever. It's like
Yes.
um, it,
What,
it it shouldn't be because ancient Sparta was actually one of the most feminist countries that's ever existed,
right?
and it's a
And
really, really, really exciting how empowered Spartan women were and
mhm,
how much respect they had. But the Spartans have been adopted by the far right, and they're very misogynist and they're very anti the reality. And I probably, because I'm a woman, they're probably less likely to read my books. And I think the same thing's true of the aviation books, unfortunately. There's an awful lot, most guys out there are pilots. If I was a woman pilot, if I was a F-7, 15 pilot, what is it?
mhm.
21, what are we on now?
Yeah, 24.
um, then they might accept me because they do. It's not that our Air Force, in fact, has a great chat. So I have a cousin who's an Air Force general. I was talking to another general the other. They're actually really excited about women being in the flying, etc. It's not that the guys they're ready to get the women that make it, but because I don't have those credentials,
I
I
see.
can't say that I am a fighter pilot. I can't say, which would be ideal, that I flew Lancasters, in World War II. That would make me much more credible. Now, the fact that Bob Doe praised the one book gave me that I could use his endorsement. And
Yes.
that sort of compensated for
Yeah.
that book. By the time I was writing Moral Fiber, they were all dead. I mean, I literally asked, I went to the Imperial War Museum, is there anybody, we could send this to that is still alive that maybe, would endorse it or whatever. And if they're there, they're not in the mood or they're whatever, they're not connected.
Hmm.
Because it's not as though I've sent it to people and they have refused to endorse it. It's that I've never found somebody that qualified who was, I could get it to.
Gotcha.
And it is a disadvantage. I still being a woman if you're writing about certain topics.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, advantage if you're writing about other topics. I'm sure men have the same thing if they're going to try to talk about, I don't know what, but
Yeah, like writing in the character of a
childbirth
woman
or
or whatever.
yeah, childbirth or
Childbirth.
child rearing might be something that people are less likely to accept a
Yes.
male. I mean, I don't mean to think this is just an anti woman thing. I just think that the topics I'm writing about are things that men are tend to be appeal more to men, and they tend to trust a male commentator more than a woman.
Hmm. Well, I can say as a reader, and I'm putting this out there to everyone watching, that I have read a lot of military history and a lot of military fiction and historical fiction, and this is it's like when I'm reading the book, I don't know that the author is a woman. I don't even think of any of that. I'm like, this is a very well written, very and it gives you've got those scenes of the Lancasters and all the other aircraft that are up there. They're getting flak from different types of armaments. I mean, and just like the differences between a piece of flak and then one of the, I think it was on the raid
Battleships.
with, yeah,
The
it's like
Tirpitz, it's the
the
Tirpitz, and she's got the
torpedoes.
15-inch guns, which were designed to sink a battleship. And it's like a little Lancaster is so fragile. They're shooting at it with guns that could sink a battleship. And this
Yes,
is
and
not fair.
it is not fair. And and how Helena writes this, it's just so exciting. And it's just, I don't think men would be doing them they would be doing themselves a disservice by not reading these books because they are just, it shouldn't matter of the gender, whoever's writing, as long as the passion is there, the research, um, and you've got it all. So I was
Thank
just
you.
curious. And I'm curious with the series you're working on now, or the first book, is it going to be a new series? Remind me again.
No, the airlift, of course, is a 3-book series, and the two
Well,
of them are out, and the last one we still got
yes, I'm
to
sorry. I
come
was
out. This
thinking of Malta, the one in progress.
Malta is what I'm researching. I'm really at the very, very early stages of
Okay.
it.
Okay.
And that's going to be 2026. And whether that'll be one or more books, I don't know yet.
Okay.
I can't say yet. But I'm
Okay.
excited. I'm really excited about it because it's going to have some Robin's in it, but
Robin.
yeah, Robin's in it because he's in Malta. But I'm also looking at the role of women in intelligence, and I'm looking at the Merchant Navy
Mm-hmm.
and torpedo bombers, which is again one of these things that people just have ignored, and incredibly, incredibly courageous and very precise weapon. I mean, there's nothing about a torpedo bomber that's, dehousing or whatever. That was very,
Right. And I've read a lot of
um,
about the torpedo bombers in the American the USAAF at the time, American Army Air Force.
mm,
Um, they had a huge attrition rate, the torpedo bombers did,
yeah,
uh,
and that was in the Pacific. I mean, that was
in the
where we were
Pacific.
going. Yeah,
Yeah,
and this is the Med. This is in the
the
Mediterranean
Mediterranean, whole
they were
different
looking at.
ball game.
Yeah. Well, no, but it's
Um,
essentially the same. It's against trips. I mean, they were used primarily up against shipping.
yeah.
So it's where you have that kind of a naval war that you see the
Hmm.
torpedo bomb.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's going to be a really exciting, and the Merchant Navy piece is really exciting to me too, which makes it's not purely an aviation book. I'm going to look at the little bit the war at sea, but from the Merchant Navy rather than the fighting Navy point of view.
That'll be very enlightening for me because I've always struggled with like what was the difference between like a merchant marine and is it just a matter of who owns the boat and you're contracting your work out? I mean, I don't even know how that works, but merchant
Civil
marine or merchant navy.
cargo ships.
So okay, cargo ships.
Merchant Navy is it's just cargo ships. They're carrying cargo, and the crews are civilians. And the Navy is the warships.
Okay, I see. So, but they're technically not soldiers or in the military. They're just,
No,
but
they're
they're not
civilians.
getting, okay. But they can be targeted just as easily as anyone else.
They're getting sunk just as badly. That's some of the things of some of the books that are talking about how, of course, rates of pay were low or sometimes low. A lot. It was dependent. The trouble with the Merchant Navy is they were private owners, so some our owners paid well, some didn't. Generally, that their pay stopped the day if they stopped working, which means the ships get torpedoed
Mhm.
under them, and it sinks. Their pay stops. They may still be in a lifeboat for the next 15 days, and
God.
whatever,
Yeah, trying to
and
survive.
having swallowed oil and be filled with bleeding and all of that.
Mhm.
No compensation. Stopped working, no more pay.
That is, that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So and they say the casualty rates were worse among merchant seamen than among in the Navy in the in the Atlantic. Okay, I'm not
Like
talking
it's,
about the Pacific War, which was a Navy war with a huge Navy. Most of what was happening in for Britain, it was the Germans were attacking British merchant vessels, sinking their vessels. They were trying to avoid the Royal Navy and attacking the vessels as soon as they were unescorted, if they were traveling alone, whenever they dispersed, and they were targeting them, that merchant navy. And as I say, and then that when you see in Malta, Malta is totally dependent on outside supplies. So the German strategy is to bomb it into submission, but also starve it into submission by ensuring that no ships get through. And there's a period in 42 where like 5 months where no ships come in, and the rations are going get round and down and down.
oh
And
wow.
the governor of Malta warns the British government that he will have to surrender because he cannot ask a civilian population to take, any more. And that's where they give them the George Cross for the entire population. But that war to fight the supplies through to Malta is part of the story.
Wow.
Fun part. Anyways, that's another topic.
I know. I'm looking forward to that though when it does roll out. Well, I'd like to just as we're kind of wrapping up here, because I do want to tease the fact that you've got this wonderful trilogy in progress. Your final book for the Berlin Airlift trilogy is going to be called Cold Victory, correct?
Yeah, correct.
And when do you expect that to be out?
It's already gone through my developmental editor, so I'm in the final edit now. And then it just goes into the process of, formatting and the
Okay.
proofreading stuff. And the goal is to bring it out in May of 2025. So
Okay.
that's essentially 6 months.
6 months. Okay. I'd like to, obviously I'm going to have you back on and we're going to discuss at least the first two books and it may be, depending on timing, everyone come back to the channel because we're going to be covering this wonderful airlift trilogy, which also features a lot of women and a lot
Yes.
of what the women did in the, for the aviation. We're talking about WAFs, as you call them WAFs or
Yeah.
WAFs,
Wow. Yeah.
yeah, so I really love that about the Berlin Airlift trilogy. Say that 5 times fast. The books. Um, but you also have some characters in Moral Fiber who kind of show up as far as like the women WAFs and how
Yep.
they. Yeah, it just evokes a whole just another world that no longer exists, but that for a time was just people coming together to rise up and fight, and fight against you know, the dark forces of
It's
fascism.
very, very, very
And
dark.
I loved it. So, but if you were going to tell someone new, like someone who just came to this video and said, "Wow, these stories sound fantastic," where would you suggest they start off with your work? Which I will link below in the descriptions box. Please check out Helena's website at Cross Seas Press. But where would you suggest they go to start this journey?
Well, my own website is helenapschrader.com,
Okay.
which has, of course, Cross Seas Press is only the more recent ones that I've done with them. So there's the broader website is just Helena P. Schrader. Um, and it does depend on what people are interested in. In a way, I think starting with Grounded Eagles, which is 3 novellas, is a good way to start because they're short.
Hmm.
It is the introduction to you should read LMF before you read Moral Fiber,
Yes.
although there's some overlap then in it.
Okay.
Um, and in chronologically, though, the Battle of Britain comes before LMF and comes before Moral Fiber, which is another thing. The Where Eagles Never Flew, the Battle of Britain novel, is it's been a #1 bestseller on Amazon. That's the most popular one of my books. I think that's because the Battle of Britain is more popular. People are
Yes.
more comfortable with that defensive battle, as I say. It's the famous few against many. It's David versus Goliath. It's got all of these elements in it. We few, we happy few, we
Hmm.
band of brothers, and that kind of thing out of Battle of Britain has, which means it attracts readers, and that's good. But it's not that it's a bad book. I love it too, and and Bob Doe said it got it right. So it's a fantastic book. Um, Chronologically it comes first, but it's a long book. Whereas if you start with Grounded Eagles, you've got 3 short novellas, which
Hmm.
may be easier to digest and then decide if you want to go on to Moral Fiber. But I think if you're into the aviation World War II, it's probably best to start with one of those
Okay.
and then go on to Moral Fiber.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. And I should say on the cover of the book, Where did you get the photos? Because at first I'm like, oh, this must be Kit Moran. He must have been a real. Do you know who these people are in the
Thank you for
photos?
asking that. Okay. The lower fiction, the lower one with the thumbs up was an Imperial War Museum film called Night Bombers. I think it's in the cover.
Okay.
And that's where I started for the cover because I thought that thumbs up was so much the feeling that this is book is having gone through the lack of moral fiber. Now he's, you know,
Yes.
now he's going to go forward. He's going to do it. He's going to face it. The other two, it's a close up. You turn over the back. The
Yep.
front picture is a close up from that crew picture in the back.
Gotcha.
Okay, that crew picture is in the International Bomber Command Center.
Okay.
It's what is it called? IBBC. It's called the Internet. I think it's, what am I saying?
International.
I'm sorry, trying to look this
Oh,
up.
no, no, you're fine.
Night Bombers, as I said, is the other question with the thumbs up. And the other one is, there's an International Bomber Command Center in Lincoln, and they have an archive of photos that people have donated, and you can
Oh,
access them online.
okay.
And it's not that easy. It was very complicated. But I had this friend who was used to working with university presses, et cetera. And we went through them, and she pulled them up, and we on a Zoom like this, and we went through the photos, and I just looked at photos until I said, "That's the crew."
Oh, okay. You let it speak to you.
And we looked at photo after photo after photo, and I just said sometimes one of the characters would look good, but then I would say no, but they don't fit the other members of the crew. The other crewmen they
Yeah.
have to that had to work.
Yeah.
And and with Kit, there's two, because if you look at LMF, you don't may not have that.
I have it
The,
in the other room. I
yeah,
do have that book.
yeah,
Yeah.
that is the same thing. I went through that, and Don Selkirk and Kit had to be in it.
Yeah.
And I looked and looked and looked until I found exactly the photo, and I said, that's them." So I used that, and these are in the public domain. We went through the whole process. And then as I said, the same thing with this one.
Mhm.
For this one, I wanted that this one's very much the tour expired. It's a happier-ish photo. Um, and that's what I wanted. And the woman is literally, I was looking at it's like fashion stuff from the
Oh,
1940.
no kidding. I love it.
I
Um,
would, but I needed, and it was the same. I just looked and looked and looked. They had and picked photos in the public domain, women 1940, 1945 or whatever, until I found someone who I thought, that's Georgina. That'll work. And then I pulled her out. In the original photo, there's two women looking at each other. And
mhm.
I cut the other one out and focused entirely on the one because she felt to me
Sure.
like, you know.
Yeah. And I have to say, and just along with the adventure and just capturing so much historical detail and bringing it to life for the reader, you're really good at writing genuine love stories, I think. And I'm not a romance reader by any means. I'm very not. That's not my genre. But between this and also the first two novels in the Berlin Airlift trilogy, I love how you write about people falling in love. So, so I
Thank
think
you.
there's something here for a lot of women who may not be into, historical fiction, or at least World War II kind of, things like that. But there's a lot of heart in this book. There's a lot of, I mean, emotion, and I think it offers something for everybody, for sure, as well as your other two books in the Berlin Airlift
Thank you.
trilogy.
And that may be the weakness because there may be that it doesn't fit into any one genre. It may have too much romance for the aviation action interested people, and maybe has too much aviation and action for people who are really interested in in
I
um,
see. Yeah.
in romance. In terms of success as a novel, I actually think it's one of my strongest books because, as I say, it integrates. Life isn't one or the other. Life is about all of those things,
It totally
and
is. And it's
it
integrated
mixes.
so well with Kit's experiences, and like you said earlier, it's a theme of uh grief and
Courage.
yeah, grief and courage, because he's also, grieving in a different way than Georgina is. But the story of how they come together is just it's realistic, which I love. That's the thing with romantic movies and things like today. I'm just like, these things don't happen in real life. They just
Yeah.
don't, you know. This was a realistic approach, but it
Thank you.
didn't lose any romance for just it being realistic. To me, it just rang true. So
Yeah.
I just want to give you
Thank
kudos
you.
for that.
Thank you.
Well, Georgina, I was going to call you
Helena.
Georgina. This is how much you've gotten into my head, Helena. Starting to call you the characters in your books now.
That's all right. I'm honored, not upset.
There's all these people are living in my head now. Um, just thank you for writing such a wonderful story, and
My
thank you for
pleasure.
joining us today to talk about moral fiber. I highly recommend to everyone you check out Grounded Eagles, which is Helena's collection of novellas, which you can also find on her website, which I've linked below.
Mm.
And moral fiber. Again, we're going to be back to talk about her trilogy on the Berlin Airlift, which was so eye-opening to me because a lot of times when I read World War II history, I stop like right at the end, you know.
Yeah.
But there's a lot that happened that we should know about, you know, in Berlin, and it kind of set the stage for the Cold War. Obviously, that's the title of your trilogy. So, um, we'll have you back on the program.
Thank you.
Yes, and thanks for joining us today from Greece. And do you have any final closing thoughts you'd like to add?
Oh no, I think we've talked long enough,
I
Peggy.
know we
Thanks
have.
very, very much. I'm really honored to be here. I'm excited to talk to somebody who understands my work because
Oh,
it's clear from your questions that you've really, really read it and
I-
just didn't just skim through it or something. And
no. I've engaged with these characters because I'm a historical fiction nut, and I've seen it done well, and I've seen it done badly, and yours are it, frankly, you're me discovering you has been the highlight of my reading life for the past year and a half. I'm like, I just discovered this new author. I, even though you've been around and you know you've been writing, but I just discovered you. So I'm excited. I'm so excited. It's just it's wonderful fiction. That's what can I say?
thank you very, very much, Peggy.
You're welcome, and we'll have you back on soon. So
Okay.
until next time, BookTube, we'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.